By the year 1877, Japan stood on the edge of a sword. The Meiji Restoration, an era of forced modernization following Emperor Meiji's return to power in 1868, had torn through centuries of tradition. Samurai lost their stipends, their swords were banned, and new taxes crushed their once privileged class. The government replaced samurai retainers with a national, conscript army, ordinary men drafted from rice fields and fishing ports, trained in Western tactics and armed with modern rifles. At the heart of this brewing unrest was Satsuma, a southern domain famed for its fierce warriors and fierce pride. Now part of Kagoshima Prefecture, Satsuma had once helped lead the push to overthrow the shogunate. Yet within a decade, it became the center of resistance against the very government it helped create. The people looked to Saigō Takamori, a man of towering presence and deep moral conviction. Once a hero of the Restoration, Saigō had retreated from Tokyo politics to his home in Kagoshima, disillusioned. He did not seek war, but his influence was vast. In the hills above the bay, his followers built shigako, private academies that trained young men in both learning and arms. They honored Bushido, the way of the warrior, even as Tokyo pushed to erase it. Then, in early January, the government moved to sever ties completely. Inspectors arrived, seeking to close the academies and confiscate weapons. Tensions snapped. On the misty morning of January 29, a group of radical cadets seized the army arsenal in Kagoshima. They raided powder stores, armed themselves with rifles, and seized warships in the bay. The governor fled north. News reached Tokyo within days. The Meiji court saw open rebellion. At his hillside home, Saigō listened in silence. These were his students, young men who saw themselves as guardians of samurai honor. They begged him to lead. He hesitated. War against the emperor's army was unthinkable. Yet he also saw betrayal, of Satsuma's warriors, of justice, of Japan's soul. He spoke quietly, "If we go to speak with the government, not to rebel. But we must go." His followers understood the message behind the words. They would march, ready for war, if war came. Saigō's force gathered in Kagoshima's harbor, 12,000 strong. Mostly young, many from Shigako, their armor was a patchwork of tradition and improvisation. Some wore lacquered cuirasses and carried katanas. Others bore Western rifles, cartridge belts over hemp tunics. They loaded horses onto boats, packed rice and powder into crates, and prepared to move north. Their goal, Tokyo, by way of Kumamoto Castle, a key fortress on Kyushu, held by imperial troops. They expected to pass peacefully. But the Meiji government, alarmed by the arsenal raid and fearful of Saigō's charisma, had already declared war. On February 15, the first columns of Saigō's army left Kagoshima. Cold winds swept the hills. Lanterns flickered over muddy roads. Couriers galloped ahead to scout the route, through Hitoyoshi, then north toward Kumamoto. Rifles were cleaned, blades sharpened, and rations distributed. Near Sendai, the first skirmishes flared. Government patrols fired warning shots. Saigō's men fired back. Blood was spilled. There would be no turning back. As the rebel force crossed the Kuma River, the Meiji army prepared its defenses. Kumamoto Castle stood ready, stone walls, iron gates, and garrisons drilled in modern warfare. Saigō now faced the storm he had tried to avoid. One night, around a campfire near Yatsushiro, a young officer named Kirino Toshiaki turned to Saigō. "We still speak of peace," he said. "But their guns say otherwise." Saigō looked into the flames. "Then let us walk toward them. With honor, if not hope." The march would test not only steel but spirit. Ahead lay modern artillery, Gatling guns, crank-fired weapons capable of mowing down 100 men in minutes, and a battle Saigō could not win by tradition alone. The march northward quickened as Saigō Takamori's columns pressed through mountain passes and valleys dusted with the last snow of winter. Spirits ran high. Towns along the way greeted the rebel army with rice, sake, and cheers. Children lined the roads, bowing to the warriors. Many still believed Saigō marched to reform the government, not to fight it. But as the days passed, reality crept in with the cold winds from the north. At Kumamoto, a city of strategic importance on the west coast of Kyushu, the imperial garrison had dug in. Kumamoto Castle, an ironclad fortress of stone and steel, rose above the city walls. Designed by military genius Kato Kiyomasa centuries earlier, it now housed over 3,000 modern soldiers, conscripts trained in firearms, drilling daily under officers educated in Europe. Major General Tani Tatiki commanded the garrison. Born of samurai stock but loyal to the Meiji throne, he respected Saigō, yet knew what must be done. Under his orders, rifle pits were dug along the southern approach. Telegraph wires buzzed with urgent messages. Artillery carriages were rolled into position. The gates were sealed. On February 22, Saigō's army reached the hills south of Kumamoto. His generals, Shinohara Kunamoto, Kirino Toshiaki, and Beppu Shinsuke, met at a shrine to consider the plan. They hoped for surrender. Saigō sent envoys under white flags, requesting safe passage. Tani refused. That night, Saigō stood at a rise overlooking the city. Lanterns flickered within the walls. Drums beat faintly in the distance. "We will not be let through," he said. "Then we test the castle." By dawn on February 24, the Satsuma army formed into ranks. Ashiguru musketeers flanked spearmen and sword-bearers. Mortars and swivel guns were positioned behind makeshift earthworks. Clouds hung low. The assault began. The attack faltered almost immediately. Kumamoto Castle, with its deep moats, steep stone ramps, and multiple watchtowers, shrugged off the first charges. Imperial troops fired disciplined volleys from rifle pits. The sound echoed like thunder. A Gatling gun raked the center column, felling men like reeds. The rebels retreated, regrouped, and struck again at night. Small teams crept toward the southern gate under cover of rain. But the defenders were alert. Flares lit the sky. Muskets flashed. Again, the attackers fell back. Saigō refused to give the order to burn the town. "These are not our enemies," he said. "Only the soldiers in the castle." His restraint won him respect, but cost him time. March began with mounting frustration. Each attempt to breach the walls drained morale. Ammunition ran low. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Rations were stretched thin. On the third night of the siege, Saigō met with Kirino and Shinohara inside a cold farmhouse. "They are not fighting like conscripts," Kirino said. "Their discipline is tight. Their engineers know what they're doing. They built the telegraph tower back in 2 days," Shinohara added. "Every strike we make, they see it coming." Saigō nodded. "This is not the war we knew." Outside, a wounded cadet knelt in the mud, hands clasped around a sword broken in half by gunfire. He had no rifle, no armor, and no illusion left. Modern war had arrived. The samurai had faced it, and found the castle walls too high. Rain soaked the mountains of western Kyushu as the Satsuma army shifted its efforts eastward. After weeks of failing to crack Kumamoto's defenses, Saigō's commanders turned toward the imperial reinforcements expected to land along the coast. Control of the inland roads near Tabaruzaka Pass became vital. Tabaruzaka lay along a ridge connecting Kumamoto and the northern plains. Whoever held it could either surround the castle, or prevent further Satsuma movement. Imperial forces, aware of this, began pouring in from Tokyo by ship and rail. The government's new arsenal was immense: steam transports, modern rifles, and American-made Gatling guns. Telegraph lines blinked from outpost to outpost, coordinating troop movements faster than any messenger on horseback. The weather turned bitter. Cold rain fell in sheets. Mud clung to boots, gun barrels, and supply carts. Powder grew damp. Fires refused to light. Rifles misfired. Roads collapsed into swamp. On March 3, over 9,000 imperial troops led by General Yamagata Aratamo moved to seize Tabaruzaka. Opposing them stood around 4,000 Satsuma fighters under Kirino Toshiaki. The rebels dug trenches and low stone walls along the hillsides, hiding behind bamboo and earthworks. Muskets were loaded carefully beneath oilcloth. Swords were oiled to prevent rust. The first clash came at dawn. Visibility was poor. Fog hugged the pass. Imperial riflemen advanced through soaked underbrush and fired volleys uphill. Satsuma snipers answered from behind stone ridges. The smoke from black powder drifted slowly in the wet air, mixing with mist and blood. Fighting surged for days. Positions changed hands in inches. One hill was taken, then lost again by nightfall. Supply lines were severed. Dead horses and broken carts lined the paths. Both sides began to ration ammunition. Soldiers resorted to hand-to-hand combat in the ravines, using bayonets and swords. On March 9, a thunderstorm struck. Lightning forked across the ridges. Tree limbs snapped. In the chaos, an imperial unit pushed too far forward and was surrounded. Kirino personally led the charge to break them. By morning, the high ground remained in Satsuma hands. But the tide was turning. Fresh government troops continued to arrive by rail from Meiji. Food, dry ammunition, and tents followed. Their engineers reinforced bridges and laid more telegraph lines. Satsuma, by contrast, was starving. Their powder was low. Many soldiers were barefoot, wrapping rags around their feet to keep out the mud. Reports arrived that Kumamoto Castle still held. No breakthrough had come. On March 15, the Imperial Army brought forward a Gatling gun and mounted it on the ridge. Cranked by hand, it fired hundreds of rounds in minutes, sweeping the hillside like a scythe. Dozens of rebels fell. Their bodies slid down the slope, soaked in rain and silence. In a ravine near the front, 2 officers crouched behind a log, waiting for a lull. "This rain, it never ends," said the younger. "It will," replied the elder, reloading his battered rifle. "But we may not see it." By March 20, Kirino ordered a slow withdrawal. What had begun as a stand had turned into attrition. The rebels pulled back, bloodied and exhausted, leaving behind only makeshift graves and burned supplies. The cost was staggering, nearly 5,000 casualties on both sides. Saigō had not been at Tabaruzaka, but he read the reports in silence. Mud, bullets, and rain had worn down his finest men. Valor could not shield against weather or hunger. The road back to Kagoshima was growing shorter. And narrower. By April, the rebellion no longer marched forward, it retreated. After the brutal grind at Tabaruzaka, Saigō Takamori's forces abandoned plans to take Kumamoto. The gates held. The castle never fell. Even worse, imperial troops now pressed in from all directions, reinforced by sea and railway. The Imperial Navy patrolled Kyushu's western coastline, landing supplies and soldiers at Yatsushiro and Miyazaki. Telegraph wires snapped orders across hundreds of miles in minutes. Infantry battalions in modern uniform followed steam locomotives through narrow valleys and tunneled ridges. Officers studied foreign manuals. Engineers constructed new outposts in days. It was warfare by blueprint, and Japan's future was drawing its lines in real time. Meanwhile, the Satsuma rebels fought through mountains and fire. Saigō ordered a broad withdrawal to Kagoshima, the heartland. His men split into columns, threading through narrow paths, shielding wounded officers, and guarding battered artillery carts. Entire villages emptied to feed them, though supplies grew scarce. Salt, powder, and rice were rationed. Doctors had no gauze, only clean rags. Every boat on the Sendai River was loaded with the injured, shoulders shattered by bullets, legs broken by shrapnel, bellies torn by steel. At Hitoyoshi, the rebels held out briefly. Houses were turned into makeshift hospitals. Lanterns glowed all night. Children boiled water. Elderly women stitched wounds with fishing twine. Every sound carried, a cough, a moan, a whispered prayer. Overhead, Imperial reconnaissance balloons floated on still mornings, marking rebel positions. Shinohara Kumamoto, ever pragmatic, took charge of defensive rearguards. "We hold just long enough," he said. "Then we vanish into the mist." Evacuations moved fast. Entire detachments dissolved into forests by sunrise, moving like ghosts across ridgelines. Imperial scouts reported seeing phantom troops where none stood. But stealth could not match steel forever. In Miyakanojo, Imperial forces surrounded a rebel unit at a crossroads shrine. A brief but savage clash followed. The rebels cut their way out, but half their number were lost. Ammunition was so low that men fought with swords alone. Still, morale did not break. The men followed Saigō with unwavering devotion. Some called him the last true samurai. Others believed he had divine favor. Each day, despite hunger and rain, warriors knelt in formation to receive orders. One rebel officer, Murata Shinpachi, wrote in his journal, "We have no food but courage. And still, he leads us." Saigō, though limping from an old leg wound, made every effort to appear strong. He walked among his soldiers without armor, offering small bows and quiet words. "We endure," he told them. "We do not fade." In a port near Kagoshima, a sailor approached a rebel commander. "The ships are ready," he said. "But the sea is rough." The commander looked to the dark horizon. "So is the path ahead. We sail anyway." By early summer, the rebels had crossed back into Satsuma province, battered but unbroken. Saigō's army was down to fewer than 3,000 men. Yet in the hills above Kagoshima Bay, they made a fateful choice, to make their last stand. The site was chosen with care, a steep hill surrounded by cliffs and sea. Its name would soon echo through history. Shiroyama. The final chapter began in the hills above Kagoshima. Shiroyama, meaning Castle Hill, rose steeply behind the city, overlooking the bay like a natural fortress. Dense forest clung to its slopes. Caves ran beneath the rock. Steep cliffs shielded the rear, while the front faced inland, toward the very government that once revered Saigō Takamori. It was here that he made his stand. The Imperial Army, under General Yamagata Aratamo, had drawn its net. Troops closed in from the north and east. Warships blockaded the bay. Telegraph stations hummed with daily reports. Steam engines unloaded crates of ammunition, barbed wire, and new artillery. The government was determined, this revolt would end, and it would end at Shiroyama. Saigō's remaining force, fewer than 500 men, fortified the hill by hand. They built trenches in staggered rings. Bamboo stakes were driven into the earth. Dry stone walls were stacked along the inner slopes. Crates of powder, wrapped in oilcloth, were buried beside firing lines. For food, they dug root pits and rationed dried fish. Water came from springs and captured rain. Every man knew, this was the last stand. Rebel morale, though strained, did not collapse. Many wore torn uniforms, mended with rice string. Their swords were sharpened nightly. Rifles were cleaned with soot and grease. They posted sentries at every rise and lit signal fires along ridgelines. When fog rolled in from the sea, they moved silently among the trees, watching and waiting. Imperial forces established a vast perimeter. By August, Shiroyama was completely encircled. Cannon crews dug into the foothills. Gatling guns were positioned in clearings, cranked and tested under tents. Spotters mapped every path up the hill. Field surgeons unpacked their gear. On August 31st, the shelling began. Artillery thundered day and night. Explosive shells smashed into rock and timber. Trees splintered. Trenches collapsed. The rebels could not fire back, every bullet counted, and there were few to spare. Then came the psychological war. Each night, Imperial officers sent messengers up the slope with letters. Some offered amnesty. Others warned of certain death. One simply said, "Saigō-dano, your time has passed." Inside a half-ruined shack near the summit, Saigō read the messages and returned them without reply. He wrote none of his own. Instead, he ordered that each man take 1 meal a day, say his prayers, and clean his weapon. Evenings grew eerily quiet. Lanterns glowed through the trees. Drum signals echoed faintly from the imperial lines. Some nights, rebels gathered to write their final letters, short, sparse, and free of complaint. "My dearest sister," one wrote. "Tell mother I walked with him to the end." In a shelter near the northern trench, 2 samurai shared a final cup of rice wine. "You still think we win this?" one asked, cracking a faint smile. The other stared into the dark. "Not win. Prove." By mid-September, Yamagata had over 30,000 troops in position. He had built a semicircle of artillery stretching from the coast to the foot of Shiroyama. The Imperial Navy prepared to fire from the sea. The final order was drafted: eliminate the rebels at dawn. No quarter. Inside the bunkers, the defenders stood ready. Darkness cloaked the mountain. A cold mist rose from the bay, wrapping the trees in silence. On Shiroyama, Saigō Takamori's final warriors stood in trench lines, their silhouettes still and waiting. Lanterns were hooded. Horses had been released the day before, none were expected to survive. A single drum sounded 3 low beats from the imperial side. Then, the bombardment began again. Artillery shells screamed down from the foothills. Explosions tore through the slope, flinging rock and timber. Fire flickered in the brush. The Gatling guns, stationed at intervals, joined the storm, hand-cranked machines rattling out metal thunder across the valley. Their bullets stitched the earth in wide arcs. The defenders crouched low, each man hugging his rifle or blade. It was not a battle. It was pressure, calculated, unrelenting, and psychological. Saigō moved from trench to trench under cover of smoke, speaking few words. His leg injury had worsened, and his steps were slow. Yet no man saw him flinch. At the northern wall, he paused to inspect a musket team. "You see the stars?" he asked, pointing above the smoke. "As long as they burn, our spirit lives." He smiled, then walked on. Throughout the night, Imperial spotters scanned the ridge for movements. Searchlights from naval vessels swept the cliffside. Messages flashed across telegraph lines: hold positions, conserve fire, maintain pressure. Inside the rebel camp, food was down to rice water and dry beans. Gunpowder was rationed by the spoonful. Each soldier had 1 full cartridge pouch, no resupply would come. Swords were sharpened with river stones. Sand was packed into the last grenades. In a small hut carved into the slope, Saigō met with his remaining officers, Beppu Shinsuke, Murata Shinpachi, and a half-dozen others. Their beards were untrimmed, eyes hollow from smoke and hunger. "We strike at dawn," Saigō said. "Not to break through, but to show we stand." The plan was simple: form ranks before sunrise and charge westward, directly at General Yamagata's lines. No retreat. No surrender. Beppu rose and offered a short bow. "Then let us die as we lived. Together." Outside, a young fighter wrote one last note in the dirt with the butt of his rifle. "For the Emperor. For Saigō. For Satsuma." At 2:30 a.m., the shelling stopped. Total silence fell. Not a torch flickered from the Imperial side. General Yamagata's men stood ready in the trenches, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed. Their orders were clear: finish it. On Shiroyama, the rebels tightened their sashes and bound their sleeves. Some tied white cloths to their foreheads, a sign of resolve. Others prayed. A few sat in silence, blades across their knees. The last charge would begin before dawn. And in that final darkness, with thunderclouds looming over Kagoshima Bay, a chapter in Japan's history neared its end. The sky was still dark when the samurai rose. A thin mist covered the ground, glowing faintly under a crescent moon. At the forward trench, Beppu Shinsuke stood with 30 men, shoulders squared, blades drawn, faces calm. To his left, Murata Shinpachi adjusted the hilt of his katana and nodded once. Behind them, Saigō Takamori emerged, helped by 2 retainers. His leg injury made every step a trial. Still, he refused to be carried. At 4 a.m., the signal was given. A conch shell rang once through the trees. The samurai surged forward. Down the slope they ran, outnumbered, outgunned, and without hope of victory. They carried swords, old rifles, and a few pistols. Some wore fragments of armor passed down from ancestors. Others wore plain cloth, their only insignia a white sash tied across the brow. The imperial lines reacted instantly. Gatling guns opened fire from both flanks. Rows of riflemen unleashed volleys from behind sandbags and barbed wire. Shells exploded behind the samurai as they moved. Yet they pressed forward with precision and purpose, leaping over trenches and charging into the fire. The first imperial outposts fell in minutes. A small squad, led by Murata, broke through a line and drove the defenders back with bayonets and blades. For a moment, they gained ground. But the weight of numbers closed in. Imperial regiments responded with overwhelming force, encircling, flanking, firing from 3 sides. Reinforcements streamed down from elevated positions. The rebels were hemmed in. The charge fractured. One by one, the samurai fell. Kirino Toshiaki, the dashing general once called the Flower of Satsuma, was among the last to be seen alive, charging alone into a rifle pit. Beppu Shinsuke was struck in the shoulder, then the leg, but crawled forward to cover Saigō's flank. Saigō himself, slowed by injury, reached a thicket near the imperial center. There, under fire, he collapsed to one knee. A stray bullet had struck his hip. Beppu, seeing him fall, rushed to his side. The two exchanged no words. What passed between them needed none. Accounts differ. Some say Beppu ended Saigō's life to preserve his dignity. Others say Saigō died of his wound moments later. What is certain is this: his sword never left his hand, and his body remained upright until the very end. Hours later, imperial troops swept the slope. Dozens of samurai lay still, many with swords clutched in frozen fingers. Smoke drifted across the battlefield. Riflemen stepped cautiously, checking for signs of life. A young soldier from Nagasaki found Beppu's body beside Saigō's. In Beppu's sash was a folded paper. Let honor live, even as we fall. By 7 a.m., Shiroyama was silent. The last rebels had fallen. General Yamagata stood over the site, hat in hand. He ordered Saigō's remains buried with care and full rites. Though the war was won, no cheer was raised. No banners were waved. The last samurai charge was over. The battlefield was quiet, but its echo spread quickly. News of Saigō Takamori's death reached Tokyo by telegraph within 24 hours. The government announced the end of the Satsuma Rebellion, the final and greatest samurai uprising in Japanese history. The official report listed the hill called Shiroyama as the site of the decisive clash. It was more than geography. It was the symbolic grave of the old world. Over 20,000 imperial troops had participated in the campaign. Thousands had fallen. Yet the modern army had prevailed. Rifles had overcome swords. Railways had outpaced horses. Artillery had buried honor beneath steel. Back in Kagoshima, the city mourned. Though rebels had brought war to their doorstep, many still revered Saigō. He had never ordered a massacre, never taken vengeance. Even in defeat, he had bowed to the emperor's portrait before the final charge. The Meiji government issued conflicting statements. In private, they feared making him a martyr. In public, they praised his courage, but condemned his rebellion. Within a year, they quietly restored his titles. A statue would later rise in Ueno Park, showing him in a simple kimono, walking his dog, not in armor, but as a citizen. Across Japan, the impact was immediate. The samurai era was officially over. The government abolished the last of the samurai stipends. The old warrior class was dissolved. Sword carrying in public was outlawed. All future armies would be drafted from commoners. Military training would follow Prussian models. New cadets would drill with bayonets, not blades. Shigako academies were closed. Their students either vanished into the countryside or joined new professions. Some became teachers. Others, police. A few left Japan entirely, seeking meaning elsewhere. Yet the spirit of the samurai did not disappear. The government, though victorious, absorbed elements of the very class it had crushed. Samurai ideals, loyalty, sacrifice, duty, were woven into military codes and school curriculums. Generals in the new army wore Western uniforms but quoted Saigō in speeches. His portrait hung quietly in homes from Kyushu to Tokyo. A Meiji official once wrote, "We killed the body. But the soul walks among us." In a quiet shrine outside Kagoshima, a priest spoke to a former rebel who now worked as a postman. "Do you think it was all for nothing?" The man adjusted his cap. "Not nothing. He taught us to stand. Even when the ground shook." By the turn of the century, Japan was an industrial nation. Its factories roared, its ships crossed oceans, and its armies conquered distant lands. But in every officer's manual, one name remained sacred: Saigō Takamori. He had fought the future. And in falling, became part of it. In the decades that followed, the name Shiroyama became more than a battlefield, it became a turning point in Japan's soul. The hill above Kagoshima, once scorched by artillery and soaked in smoke, grew silent again. Wildflowers sprouted where trenches had crumbled. Children played in the shadow of the slope, unaware that a nation had bled there to be reborn. Saigō Takamori's image changed over time. To the Meiji elite, he had been a tragic traitor, noble, but misguided. To the people of Satsuma, he was always Saigō-san, a man of strength, kindness, and unshakable loyalty. His face appeared on murals, in textbooks, and eventually, on currency. The sword he carried at Shiroyama was preserved, displayed not as a weapon, but as a symbol. The imperial army, the very force that defeated him, adopted his values. Officers were trained to emulate his calm under pressure, his care for subordinates, and his refusal to abandon dignity, even in defeat. His final stand was studied in war colleges not just for tactics, but for character. One general wrote, "He showed us how to fall, without bowing." In Kagoshima, many of the surviving rebels returned quietly to civilian life. Some became farmers again, tending the same soil they had marched across with rifles slung over their backs. Others helped build schools, post offices, and city halls. Their children would grow up in a modern Japan, educated, uniformed, and trained in sciences Saigō had never known. The war had cost over 20,000 lives. Yet it had not fractured the country. Instead, it forced a reckoning. Japan had chosen its path, modern, centralized, industrial. The age of castle sieges, sword duels, and personal banners had ended. The age of factories, trains, and national identity had begun. And yet, every year, on the anniversary of the battle, citizens climbed Shiroyama with lanterns. They placed flowers where the rebels had made their stand. Not in protest. Not in mourning. But in memory. In a Kagoshima schoolhouse, a teacher once asked her class, "What did Saigō fight for?" A boy stood and said, "He didn't fight the emperor. He fought to be worthy of him." Even as Japan stepped into the 20th century, victorious in wars, rising in power, it carried the memory of 1877 like a quiet ember. Saigō Takamori's rebellion had failed. But his ideals, honor, sacrifice, loyalty, had survived. They shaped the very world that rose in his absence. And as steel trains crossed mountain bridges, as modern ships filled harbors, the spirit of a man with a limp, a sword, and a quiet voice lingered behind them, watching. Japan did not forget. Years after the final gunfire echoed off Shiroyama, the site was transformed. Stones from collapsed trenches were gathered into quiet memorials. The names of fallen samurai were etched into tablets. At the summit, a statue of Saigō Takamori was placed, not as a warrior, but as a man walking his dog in civilian dress. Not defiant, not defeated, simply enduring. His image stood between two eras. To the old Japan, he was the final sword-bearer. To the new, he was the bridge between loyalty and reform. In Tokyo, bureaucrats drafted new laws and universities opened. Trains sped across islands once ruled by warlords. Uniforms replaced armor. Conscripted soldiers, farmers, merchants, fishermen, saluted beneath a single flag. Yet the values Saigō had stood for were not erased. They were transformed. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued years later, emphasized loyalty, honor, self-sacrifice, phrases taken almost directly from Saigō's letters. In schools, children were taught to respect duty over self. Many of the men who built Japan's modern army, Yamagata Aratamo, Tani Tatiki, and others, had once studied Saigō's character before they faced him in battle. His enemies became his students. His defeat became their foundation. Back in Satsuma, former rebels became city clerks, postal carriers, and factory foremen. Their children joined the new society, learning mathematics instead of martial drills. And yet, in the corners of their homes, small altars still held portraits of Saigō. Not because he won, but because he had stood for something, even when the world moved past him. By the early 20th century, Japan had become a world power. It fought wars abroad, built industry, and asserted itself among Western empires. But deep in its identity, it still carried the ember of the samurai soul, not in swordsmanship, but in spirit. And every year, on the morning of September 24th, lanterns are still lit along the slopes of Shiroyama. Not to celebrate war. Not to revive rebellion. But to honor a moment when men, outmatched and outnumbered, chose to rise together, for loyalty, for principle, and for the soul of a nation. To this day, Saigō Takamori remains one of the most respected figures in Japanese history. He did not win the battle. But he helped define the heart of modern Japan. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share. For more true tales from history's turning points, stay tuned.